Imagine a land perched on the edge of Europe, where rugged cliffs meet the endless Atlantic, and a tiny kingdom begins to dream of worlds beyond the horizon. Sit back, relax, and let your mind drift to the early 12th century, a time of fierce battles, shifting loyalties, and a kingdom in the making. What would become Portugal was then no more than a borderland, a contested space caught between Christian and Muslim forces, where every hill and river could decide the fate of a people. In the year 1139, a young nobleman named Alfonso Henriquez dared to defy not only his enemies, but the very conventions of his time. He declared himself king after defeating his own mother's forces in a violent clash of family and power. At that moment, Alfonso was not yet a ruler of lands, but a seeker of sovereignty, a man determined that Portugal would not remain a vassal to the Kingdom of Leon. He led campaigns that spanned the rugged northern hills and the sun-baked southern plains, clashing with rival Christian lords and Muslim territories alike. The Battle of Uric, legendary in its brutality and intensity, became his defining triumph. There, he claimed not only victory, but a divine endorsement, a sign that his claim to kingship was sanctioned by forces beyond the mortal realm. Yet winning a battle was only the first step. Recognition from neighboring kingdoms and the Pope himself proved elusive, a decades-long negotiation that would test the patience and resolve of a fledgling nation. It was not until 1179, nearly 40 years later, that Pope Alexander III issued a papal bull acknowledging Portugal as a sovereign Christian kingdom, a declaration that would anchor the nation's identity for centuries to come. Geography shaped this kingdom as much as its rulers. Bordered by Spain to the east and the vast Atlantic to the west, Portugal's landward expansion promised peril, while the sea offered opportunity, a gateway to distant shores and unknown possibilities. Even in these early centuries, a maritime character began to emerge, hinting at ambitions that would one day stretch across continents. But the path was far from smooth. Internal strife, succession crises, and the looming shadow of the Reconquista created a landscape where ambition met danger at every turn. It was a land defined by struggle, resilience, and the restless imagination of its people. And yet, from these turbulent beginnings, the seeds of a global empire were quietly being sown. As Portugal's borders stabilized and its kings turned their gaze outward, the stage was being set for a journey that would carry a small nation across oceans, through storms, and into the pages of history. But how did these early battles, these tentative steps into sovereignty, lead to the dawn of an empire that would encircle the globe? That story, filled with intrigue, ambition, and discovery, is where we turn next. With independence secured and the young kingdom of Portugal finally recognized by the Pope and its neighbors, the nation entered a period of both consolidation and cautious ambition. The 14th century was a time of turbulence across Europe, and Portugal was no exception. The Black Death arrived in 1348, sweeping through villages and cities, leaving death and disruption in its wake. Perhaps a third of the population perished, reshaping labor, economy, and society. Fields lay fallow, towns emptied, and the old feudal hierarchies began to waver under the pressure of scarcity and social unrest. Amid this instability, the death of King Fernando, without a male heir, sparked a succession crisis that could have dissolved the fragile sense of Portuguese identity. Rival claimants from neighboring Castile sought to impose control, threatening to erase the young kingdom from the map. It was in this crucible of crisis that a new dynasty emerged, the House of Avis, João of Avis, a master of military strategy and deeply devoted to Portuguese sovereignty, rallied support among nobles and commoners alike. His victory at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385 was not just a military triumph, it was a defining moment, a vivid affirmation that Portugal would remain distinct, independent, and resilient. The battle itself, fought on open fields with the roar of arrows, the clash of swords, and the thundering charge of cavalry, became legend. In the aftermath, João I was crowned king, and Portugal found itself guided by a dynasty that would preside over the birth of an empire. This era also forged enduring alliances. The Treaty of Windsor in 1386 linked Portugal and England in one of history's oldest diplomatic partnerships, a bond that would later prove crucial for trade, navigation, and military support. But while kings and nobles shaped politics, it was the imagination of the next generation that would propel Portugal into the unknown. João I and his queen, Philippa of Lancaster, raised a lineage often called the illustrious generation, a group of sons who would combine ambition, curiosity, and naval skill to chart the world. Among them was Prince Henry, later known as Henry the Navigator, whose fascination with geography, astronomy, and the sea would transform Portugal's destiny. Yet even before Henry set sail, the foundations were being laid, a kingdom stabilized by military success, connected to European allies, and increasingly oriented toward the Atlantic. The sea, once a boundary of isolation, now appeared as a vast expanse of possibility, shimmering under the sun and whispering promises of distant lands, unknown riches, and encounters with peoples far beyond Iberia. It is here, on this precipice between land and ocean, tradition and innovation, that Portugal would take its first cautious steps toward becoming a truly global power. But what drove this small kingdom, still recovering from plague and political turmoil, to imagine voyages across vast, uncharted oceans? The answer begins with one man's vision and one city along the southern coast, where the dream of exploration would become a reality. Prince Henry, the third son of King João I and Queen Philippa, was not destined to inherit thrones or vast territories, but he would inherit something arguably more powerful: vision. Born in 1394, he grew up in a Portugal still consolidating its borders and recovering from the tremors of plague and civil conflict. From an early age, Henry was drawn not to the courtly life of feasts and diplomacy, but to maps, compasses, and the whisper of the ocean. By the early 1400s, he began to assemble what some historians call his school of navigation at Sagres, on the windswept cliffs of southern Portugal. Whether a formal institution or a gathering of minds, Sagres became a hub for cartographers, shipbuilders, astronomers, and seasoned sailors, all united by one goal: to unlock the mysteries of the Atlantic. The Portuguese caravel, small, maneuverable, and capable of tacking against the wind, became the key tool for these ambitions. Combined with the astrolabe, improved charts, and the magnetic compass, Portuguese sailors could venture farther and with greater confidence than any Europeans before them. But the question lingered: what lay beyond the horizon? In 1415, Portugal made its first tentative step beyond Europe with the conquest of Ceuta, a bustling North African port. Though not a grand prize in itself, Ceuta was a gateway rich with trade in gold, ivory, spices, and slaves, and a foothold in a wider, unfamiliar world. Henry recognized its value, not just for commerce, but for strategic projection, and it inspired a generation of explorers. Over the next 2 decades, Portuguese ships ventured south along the West African coast, Each new headland, river, and village charted added to a growing map of the unknown. The early voyages were fraught with fear and uncertainty. Sailors whispered of sea monsters, boiling waters, and waterspouts that could drag entire ships beneath the waves. Yet the lure of gold, the hope of Christian allies, and the ambition to find the legendary Prester John kept the fleets pressing onward. In 1434, the rounding of Cape Bargador shattered centuries of superstition. For the first time, sailors penetrated the waters long feared as impassable, a barrier once thought to mark the edge of the known world. With each successful expedition, Portuguese influence spread, trading posts emerged, African societies were contacted, and a pattern of commerce and exploitation began to crystallize. By the 1440s, caravels had reached the Gambia River and Cape Verde, and the first human cargo from Africa arrived in Lisbon, marking the grim beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade. Henry's ventures were a fusion of curiosity, faith, and ambition, a mixture of light and shadow, discovery and exploitation. Under his guidance, Portugal transformed from a small, Atlantic-oriented kingdom into a maritime pioneer, a nation learning to read the stars, the currents, and the secrets of distant lands. But while the coastline of Africa was gradually revealed, a far greater prize awaited beyond the horizon: the spice-rich lands of Asia, and the sea routes that would make Portugal the first true global empire. By the mid-15th century, Portuguese caravels had transformed the Atlantic from a boundary into a vast, navigable highway. Ships hugged the West African coastline, charting rivers, capes, and islands that had long been shrouded in mystery for Europeans. Each voyage was both a scientific expedition and an act of ambition. Sailors brought back gold, ivory, exotic fruits, and enslaved people, their arrival in Lisbon reshaping commerce and society. The small coastal settlements of Africa became the first Portuguese outposts. Early experiments in governance, trade, and military presence far from the familiar lands of Europe. Some were temporary trading posts for a season. Others endured, laying the groundwork for a network of influence that would stretch across continents. Yet exploration was never just about goods. Portuguese navigators sought knowledge, accurate maps, winds, currents, and astronomical observations. They collected the stories of local rulers and traders, recording names, customs, and myths that would later guide larger fleets. By the 1470s, expeditions reached as far south as the Congo River, revealing vast, densely populated regions rich in resources. Portugal's encounters with African kingdoms were complex. Some rulers engaged in trade willingly, supplying gold and enslaved captives. Others resisted, wary of these foreign interlopers. Portuguese diplomacy, alliances, and sometimes force became tools to secure influence, creating patterns that would echo in colonies half a world away. Meanwhile, the Portuguese crown continued to invest heavily in maritime expertise. Under Prince Henry's guidance, shipbuilding techniques improved, sails and hulls adapted to long voyages, and knowledge of monsoon winds began to take shape, hinting at future routes to India. Henry's death in 1460 did not end this momentum. Rather, it inspired a generation of explorers who would carry Portugal beyond Africa. By the late 15th century, the focus shifted to the ultimate prize, the Indian Ocean. Europe's access to spices, silks, and other luxuries was controlled by overland routes through Muslim territories, a monopoly that frustrated Lisbon's merchants and monarchs. Portugal's solution was audacious: to sail around Africa and establish direct contact with the rich trading centers of Asia. Bartolomeu Dias would eventually round the southernmost tip of Africa, a feat long imagined but feared, opening the gateway to the east. The vision of Vasco da Gama, who would follow, promised an entirely new order, a maritime empire spanning from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Yet, the lessons learned along the African coast, navigation, trade, diplomacy, and conquest would prove crucial. They were the training ground, the laboratory, where Portugal learned not just to explore, but to project power, exploit wealth, and assert control over distant peoples and lands. These coastal adventures, seemingly small at first, were the first steps in a journey that would create the world's first truly global empire. And as Portugal set its eyes on India, the age of exploration was about to enter its most transformative chapter, one filled with wealth, violence, wonder, and the reshaping of entire continents. The year was 1488, when Bartolomeu Dias, a seasoned Portuguese navigator, achieved what had long been considered impossible. He rounded the southern tip of Africa, a jagged, storm-lashed promontory that would later be named the Cape of Good Hope. For centuries, European sailors had feared this region, imagining boiling seas, monstrous waves, and unknown perils lurking in the fog. But Dias's voyage proved that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected, and that a direct maritime route to Asia was within reach. The significance of this achievement cannot be overstated. It was more than a geographic breakthrough. It was the opening of a corridor to unimaginable wealth, the gateway to spices, silks, and exotic commodities that Europe had long craved but could only access through intermediaries. Portugal, a nation of fewer than 2 million, was now on the brink of global influence. Building on Dias's daring feat, Vasco da Gama was commissioned in 1497 to complete the journey to India. The expedition consisted of 4 ships, sturdy caravels equipped for long ocean travel, and a crew prepared for months of uncertainty. They navigated the treacherous Atlantic, carefully following the wind patterns and currents charted by their predecessors. Each night, sailors relied on stars and astrolabes to maintain their course, while whispers of fear and superstition lingered below deck. After months at sea, passing the Cape, and battling storms, hunger, and disease, Da Gama and his fleet entered the waters of the Indian Ocean, reaching Calicut on the Malabar coast in 1498. The arrival was met with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and hostility from local rulers and merchants. Portuguese ambitions were clear: to secure access to the spice trade, establish fortified trading posts, and assert dominance over the sea routes that had enriched Arab, Indian, and other Asian powers for centuries. Negotiations, misunderstandings, and occasional violence marked these early encounters. But Da Gama returned to Portugal with spices, rare gems, and tales of vast riches, his voyage demonstrating the feasibility of a direct trade route that bypassed overland intermediaries. This achievement ignited a wave of Portuguese expeditions to Asia, establishing the first true footholds of a European empire on the subcontinent. It was also the beginning of a new global system, one in which Portugal could project power thousands of miles from home. Yet these successes carried shadows. The quest for wealth and influence came at the cost of local populations, initiating patterns of conflict, exploitation, and cultural imposition that would follow the empire for centuries. The oceans were now highways of commerce and conquest, and Portugal stood at the helm. But as the Portuguese pushed further into the Indian Ocean, they would encounter rivals, both European and indigenous, whose resistance would shape the future of the empire in ways few could yet imagine. The world was opening up, and Portugal was poised to step through that door, leaving footprints that would be felt across continents by the dawn of the 16th century. The Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean had evolved from daring voyages into permanent footholds along the coast of India. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral sailed into what would become Brazil, but his eyes remained fixed on the riches of Asia. The crown's priority, however, was India. In 1505, Francisco de Almeida was appointed the first Portuguese viceroy in India, tasked with creating fortified trading posts, or fetorias, to secure control over commerce in spices, textiles, and precious metals. The first of these fortresses was established at Cochin, a small but strategically located port on the Malabar coast. The construction of stone walls, cannons facing the sea, and garrison soldiers symbolized Portugal's intention to dominate trade, not merely visit distant lands. These fortifications also marked the beginning of a pattern that would define Portuguese imperialism: the projection of power through a network of coastal strongholds, rather than territorial occupation of large inland areas. Portuguese officials relied heavily on alliances with local rulers, negotiating treaties, marriages, and trade agreements to maintain influence. The interplay of diplomacy and military force was delicate. Missteps could provoke resistance or rebellion. Alongside the forts, Portuguese merchants and missionaries worked tirelessly to weave their presence into the social and economic fabric of India. They established churches, schools, and marketplaces, spreading Christianity alongside commerce. At the same time, the Portuguese aggressively challenged the existing maritime powers. Arab, Indian, and later Ottoman merchants had dominated spice routes for centuries, and Portuguese caravels, armed with cannons and disciplined crews, disrupted these networks. The siege of key ports and the control of choke points allowed Portugal to command not only the flow of goods, but also the flow of wealth back to Europe. Goa, captured in 1510 by Afonso de Albuquerque, would become the jewel of this empire in Asia, serving as the administrative capital, a naval base, and a hub of trade and culture. The city's narrow streets, bustling harbors, and imposing forts reflected both the opportunities and tensions of imperial expansion. Portuguese India was not a simple colony. It was a complex, hybrid world where European technology met Indian traditions, and commerce intertwined with religion and politics. Here, the seeds of global connectivity were sown, and the foundations of a centuries-long empire were laid. But with influence came conflict. The aggressive expansion of Portuguese power would soon provoke rivals, near and far rivals, who would test the resilience of this tiny nation's claim to distant continents. The stage was set for confrontations that would echo across oceans, shaping not only the fate of Portugal, but the contours of world history itself. While Asia promised spices and gold, Africa and the Atlantic islands became the proving grounds of Portuguese ambition and ingenuity. By the early 15th century, explorers and settlers had begun transforming uninhabited or sparsely populated Atlantic islands Madeira, the Azores, and later Cape Verde to thriving colonies. The volcanic soil of Madeira proved fertile for sugarcane, a crop that would soon reshape European tastes and economies. Portuguese planters imported labor from mainland Portugal, and as demand for sugar grew, the reliance on enslaved African labor became an integral part of the system. At the same time, the Portuguese advanced steadily along the West African coast. The voyages of sailors like Nuno, Tristão, Dias, and Diogo Key extended Portugal's reach beyond Cape Verde, Sierra Leone, and the Congo. Each landing brought not only new maps and knowledge, but also complex interactions with local African communities. Some rulers welcomed trade for gold, ivory, and enslaved people, while others resisted, leading to violent clashes. The Portuguese constructed fortified trading posts, from Arguim to Elmina, which became both commercial hubs and symbols of European military dominance on foreign shores. These coastal outposts allowed Portugal to control trade routes and secure access to valuable resources without attempting to conquer vast inland territories, a strategy that balanced ambition with practicality. It was in this crucible of exploration and commerce that the foundations of the Atlantic slave trade were cemented. Portuguese ships transported African captives to the Atlantic islands, to Lisbon, and eventually across the ocean to the Americas. By the mid-15th century, this trade was becoming systematic, combining profit, logistics, and maritime innovation. Portugal's small population could not match its ambitions without exploiting these networks, and its fleets grew more sophisticated, using caravels and carracks capable of long oceanic voyages. Yet, this expansion was not without tension. Local populations, rival European powers, and even missionaries occasionally challenged Portuguese authority. Every fort, every sugar mill, every ship represented both opportunity and risk. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the wealth flowing from African gold and sugar fueled the Portuguese monarchy, enabling further expeditions and consolidating royal power. The Atlantic islands became laboratories of imperial ambition, a bridge between the old world and the new. Here, Portugal honed the techniques of trade, colonization, and exploitation that would define its empire for centuries. But as Portugal reached further across oceans and continents, each success planted the seeds of future challenges, rivalries, and moral quandaries that would haunt the empire for generations to come. The story of conquest and commerce was far from over, and the world beyond Africa's shores beckoned with both promise and peril. By the late 15th century, the Atlantic had become a proving ground for Portuguese navigators. But the real prize lay beyond the fabled riches of Asia. The southern tip of Africa, shrouded in legend and feared by sailors, loomed as the key to the Indian Ocean. Many believed that deadly currents, treacherous storms, and monstrous sea creatures guarded its waters. Yet Portugal's determination could not be swayed. Under the guidance of Prince Henry's successors, explorers like Bartolomeu Dias finally rounded the southern cape in 1488, a moment that sent ripples through Europe. Dias named it the Cape of Storms, though it would later be rechristened the Cape of Good Hope, a symbolic gateway to India's spices, silks, and wealth. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama's expedition achieved what generations of adventurers had dreamed, a direct sea route from Europe to India, sailing around Africa's southern tip, navigating the vast open waters of the Indian Ocean. Da Gama reached Calicut on the Malabar coast in 1498. The arrival of a small fleet of Portuguese ships in India sent shockwaves through local kingdoms and trading networks, introducing a new European power with ambition, military technology, and naval mastery. Portugal's presence was not merely commercial. It was strategic, militarized, and relentless. Forts and trading posts sprang up along the Indian coastline, from Cochin to Goa, anchoring Portugal's influence in the region. It was Afonso de Albuquerque, a brilliant yet ruthless strategist, who transformed these footholds into an empire. Albuquerque envisioned a network of fortified ports controlling the Indian Ocean trade, leveraging naval power to dominate spice routes, and establishing a Portuguese monopoly on lucrative commodities. He captured strategic locations, including Goa in 1510 and Malacca in 1511, demonstrating the lethal combination of diplomacy, cunning, and brute force. The Portuguese fleet imposed a new order on centuries-old trading networks, challenging Muslim merchants, local sultanates, and even other European powers. Yet, with conquest came complexity. The Portuguese had to navigate cultural differences, religious tensions, and alliances with diverse local rulers. Missionaries accompanied soldiers and traders, spreading Christianity alongside commerce. In parallel, Portuguese navigators mapped coastlines, catalogued exotic flora and fauna, and brought back knowledge that would shape European understanding of the wider world. The Indian Ocean became a theatre of Portuguese ingenuity, where small fleets could project influence across vast distances, and where commerce, coercion, and curiosity intertwined. These early victories in Asia solidified Portugal's reputation as a global maritime power, setting the stage for centuries of overseas dominance. But with every conquest and port captured, the Portuguese Empire stretched further from its homeland, and the challenges of holding such far-flung territories would grow ever more complex, planting the seeds of tension that would echo into the future. With Goa secured and Malacca under Portuguese control, Portugal's presence in Asia began to take on the contours of a true empire. These were not merely trading posts. They were fortified enclaves designed to control commerce, project military power, and establish a Portuguese vision of order across the Indian Ocean. Ships laden with spices, silks, precious gems, and exotic goods began the long voyage back to Lisbon, fueling immense wealth and the imagination of Europe. But this empire was fragile by design. Portuguese holdings were tiny islands of influence, in a sea of independent kingdoms and well-established trading networks that had existed for centuries. Maintaining control required constant vigilance, diplomacy, and, when necessary, ruthless force. Afonso de Albuquerque. Strategies emphasized both, creating alliances with local rulers while demonstrating the consequences of resistance. Portuguese naval technology, superior to most regional fleets, became the backbone of this strategy, allowing small forces to dominate larger adversaries. Meanwhile, the empire's reach extended further east. In 1557, the Portuguese established Macau on the southern coast of China, a small enclave that would become a gateway to East Asian trade and influence. Macau was unique. It was not conquered through force, but negotiated through diplomacy, as the Ming dynasty recognized Portuguese authority in exchange for controlled trade. From here, Portuguese ships sailed to Japan, Southeast Asia, and beyond, linking previously isolated regions through commerce and cultural exchange. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits, accompanied these voyages, spreading Christianity while documenting the diverse cultures and knowledge of Asia. The empire's growth, however, came at a human cost. The Portuguese engaged in the emerging Atlantic and Indian Ocean slave trades, transported labor, and imposed monopolies that disrupted centuries-old trade systems. Internal governance relied heavily on rigid hierarchies, loyalty to the crown, and a small cadre of Portuguese settlers and administrators. Despite these challenges, the empire thrived for decades, fueled by an insatiable European appetite for spices, textiles, and exotic goods. Wealth poured into Lisbon, funding further explorations and inspiring a culture of navigation, cartography, and scientific curiosity. But the very distance and diversity that made the empire profitable also made it vulnerable. Communication delays, local resistance, and competing European powers, especially the Dutch and the English, would gradually test the limits of Portuguese control. The small nation that had once seemed destined only for survival on Europe's western edge was now entangled in a complex web spanning continents, oceans, and cultures. Each new port, fort, and trade route reinforced Portugal's global ambition, yet hinted at the fragility that would, centuries later, contribute to its decline. And as Portugal looked westward across the Atlantic, a new continent awaited discovery, promising wealth and opportunity, but also the seeds of future conflict and colonization. As Portuguese explorers pushed eastward into the Indian Ocean, another chapter of their empire was quietly unfolding across the Atlantic. In 1500, a fleet led by Pedro Álvares Cabral landed on the eastern coast of what would later be called Brazil. The lush forests, vast rivers, and seemingly endless coastline presented a world both beautiful and untamed, a land ripe for exploration and exploitation. Initially, the Portuguese crown showed limited interest, focused as it was on the rich spice islands of Asia, yet the discovery of Brazil would prove transformative. The Portuguese soon realized the potential of its timber, sugar, and other natural resources. By the mid-16th century, settlers, missionaries, and adventurers began to establish small coastal settlements, bringing with them European architecture, Catholicism, and the structures of governance that mirrored those in Lisbon. Sugar, however, became the empire's defining commodity in the Americas. Plantations sprouted along the northeastern coast, often in breathtaking yet dangerous locations, where rivers met the sea and swaying palms dotted fertile fields. Cultivating sugar required immense quantities of it. Indigenous peoples were initially forced into servitude, but European diseases, harsh conditions, and resistance decimated their populations. The Portuguese turned increasingly to Africa, importing enslaved people to work the sugar fields and sustain the colony's economy. This was the beginning of a transatlantic system that would grow into one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Economically, Brazil's wealth enriched the crown and Lisbon's merchants, creating a network of trade that stretched from African ports to European markets and back across the Atlantic. Politically, the colony required new forms of administration, as governors and local councils attempted to impose order on a vast, sparsely settled land. Culturally, Brazil became a melting pot of European, indigenous, and African influence as a legacy that would endure for centuries. While the empire's Asian holdings relied on naval dominance and trade monopolies, Brazil demanded territorial control, settlement, and a different kind of endurance. From the grand sugar mills to the dense Amazon interior, Portugal faced challenges of scale, disease, and resistance, yet the colony grew steadily. By the late 16th century, the promise of Brazil drew adventurers, settlers, and fortune seekers, many willing to risk the unknown for wealth and prestige. And as the sun set over the Atlantic, illuminating endless stretches of forest and river, one could almost hear the whispers of a new imperial chapter, one that would shape the destiny of continents and peoples far beyond Europe. Yet even as Brazil flourished, rival European powers began to eye Portuguese holdings, planting the seeds of conflict that would define the next centuries. The empire had crossed oceans, but would it withstand the storm of competition and rebellion looming on the horizon? By the mid-16th century, Brazil was no longer merely a distant landfall on the maps of Europe. It had become a stage for imperial ambition, economic exploitation, and cultural transformation. Coastal settlements, such as Salvador and Recife, emerged as centers of administration, commerce, and religion, their whitewashed churches and fortresses standing as symbols of Portugal's claim to the New World. Yet the land behind the beaches and rivers remained wild, inhabited by indigenous peoples who resisted encroachment with both skill and ferocity. The Portuguese crown, aware that claiming a vast territory required more than flags and papal decrees, implemented the captaincy system, dividing the coast into strips governed by hereditary grantees who were tasked with settlement, defense, and the promotion of agriculture. Some captaincies thrived, fueled by fertile soil and rivers that allowed transport, while others floundered, abandoned to the forest or indigenous resistance. Sugar emerged as the economic heartbeat of Brazil, its cultivation demanding vast labor forces and intricate irrigation systems. Initially, indigenous peoples were enslaved, but European diseases decimated their numbers, forcing the Portuguese to increasingly rely on enslaved Africans, transported across the Atlantic in brutal conditions. This marked the deepening of a transatlantic trade network, one in which ships laden with enslaved people, sugar, and timber would sail between continents, enriching Portugal and its merchants. Yet Brazil was far from secure. French adventurers and privateers, drawn by rumors of gold and fertile lands, made repeated incursions along the coastline, often allying with local indigenous groups to challenge Portuguese authority. In the early 17th century, the Dutch also arrived, their well-armed fleets seeking a foothold in the sugar-rich northeast. For Portugal, defending Brazil required military ingenuity, diplomacy, and the mobilization of settlers, African allies, and mercenaries. The struggle was not merely external. Internal rebellion, banditry, and competition between captaincies threatened to destabilize the fragile colony. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits, moved through these regions with dual aims, converting indigenous populations to Christianity and mediating conflicts, sometimes offering a measure of protection from the harshest abuses of colonial settlers. The cultural and demographic tapestry of Brazil began to take shape: European architecture and Catholic ritual, indigenous languages and knowledge, African traditions and labor, all entwined in a complex, often violent, but resilient society. By the late 17th century, Brazil had evolved into a crucial part of the Portuguese Empire, an Atlantic jewel of sugar, timber, and later gold. Yet even as wealth flowed across the seas to Lisbon, the colony faced the looming spectre of foreign invasion, internal unrest, and the challenges of governing a land of vast distances and diverse peoples. The question lingered: could Portugal maintain control over a colony so far from home, or would Brazil chart a path toward independence long before the empire itself began to crumble? While Brazil was growing into a cornerstone of the Portuguese Empire across the Atlantic, across the seas in Africa and Asia, Portugal was crafting a network of trading posts, forts, and colonies that would extend its influence thousands of miles from Lisbon. Beginning in the late 15th century, following the pioneering voyages of Prince Henry and later explorers, the Portuguese established footholds along the West African coast from Ceuta and Arguim to the Gold Coast, selecting harbors and rivers that could support fortified settlements and control the flow of trade. These were not mere trading posts. They were small citadels of empire, armed with cannons, staffed by soldiers and merchants. and meticulously designed to project power over both sea and shore. In Asia, the Portuguese ambitions became even bolder. The capture of Goa in 1510 marked a turning point, establishing a base that allowed Portugal to dominate the Arabian Sea and assert influence over Indian Ocean commerce. The fortress city quickly became a hub for spices, textiles, and precious stones, drawing traders, missionaries, and adventurers alike. Alongside Goa, Portuguese control extended to Malacca in 1511, a strategic choke point connecting the South China Sea with the Indian Ocean, allowing Lisbon to monitor and tax the flow of trade from China, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Portugal's strategy relied on superior naval technology, heavily armed ships known as Nors, and the expertise of navigators who could traverse treacherous monsoon winds and uncharted waters. But their expansion was never uncontested. Local kingdoms and sultanates resisted, forming shifting alliances to counter Portuguese power. In Africa, the Kingdom of Congo navigated a complex relationship with Lisbon, adopting aspects of European culture and Christianity while resisting full subjugation. In India and Southeast Asia, Muslim traders, local rulers, and emerging European competitors like the Dutch and the English challenged Portugal's monopoly, leading to skirmishes, sieges, and the constant threat of rebellion. Portuguese settlements often became melting pots of culture and conflict. European architecture rising alongside Hindu, Muslim, and Buddhist communities. Missionaries seeking converts while merchants pursued profit. Soldiers enforcing imperial will while local populations navigated survival and resistance. By the mid-16th century, Portugal had created a web of influence that connected continents, controlled critical maritime routes, and allowed the empire to participate in a global economy unlike any Europe had seen before. Yet this success carried hidden costs, stretched resources, distant territories, and relentless resistance foreshadowed the difficulties that would haunt the empire for centuries. Could a small kingdom maintain such a vast network, or would the weight of distance, conflict, and ambition eventually pull it apart? By the early 16th century, the Portuguese Empire had firmly established itself as a dominant maritime power, and nowhere was this more evident than in Asia. The spice trade, long the object of European desire, became the crown jewel of Lisbon's ambitions. Cloves from the Moluccas, nutmeg from Banda, pepper from Malabar, and cinnamon from Ceylon were worth their weight in gold, and Portugal had managed, through daring navigation and military might, to insert itself directly into these lucrative networks. The capture of Goa in 1510 was only the beginning. From there, Portuguese ships sailed across the Indian Ocean, linking Mozambique, Socotra, and Hormuz into a chain of fortified ports designed to control not just trade, but the flow of information, culture, and power. These posts, sometimes little more than walled cities with garrisons and warehouses, projected Portuguese influence thousands of miles from Europe. Merchants and missionaries worked side by side. Jesuits converted local populations, while Portuguese traders ensured the empire reaped the wealth. Yet, success in Asia was precarious. The Portuguese often relied on superior naval firepower, heavily armed caraffes and caravels, to assert dominance over established Indian Ocean trade networks. Arab, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants, some centuries older in their maritime expertise, resented European intrusion, and intermittent skirmishes became the norm. In 1511, the conquest of Malacca allowed Portugal to control the critical strait connecting the South China Sea with the Indian Ocean, ships laden with spices, silks, and porcelain passed under Lisbon's gaze. But this power came at a constant cost, maintaining fortified posts, negotiating with local rulers, and defending against both European competitors and indigenous resistance demanded immense resources. The Portuguese crown's centralized profits from these ventures, with the Casa da India in Lisbon overseeing trade, taxation, and exploration. But beyond commerce, the empire was also a vehicle for religion, diplomacy, and prestige. Missionaries accompanied fleets, introducing Christianity while documenting local customs, creating a unique cultural record of an increasingly interconnected world. However, cracks were already forming in this glittering facade. Other European powers, first the Dutch, then the English and the French, began to probe Portuguese holdings, seeking to break the monopoly on spices. Local kingdoms, while sometimes cooperative, could quickly turn hostile, and long supply lines stretched Portuguese resources to the breaking point. The empire was powerful, impressive, even awe-inspiring, yet its reach was beginning to expose its fragility. Could a nation of barely 2 million truly govern such an immense and diverse network? The answer, in time, would reveal both the brilliance and the peril of Portugal's Asian empire. As the 16th century unfolded, the Portuguese Empire's dominance in Asia began to attract attention from emerging European powers. The Dutch, driven by a growing maritime economy and the desire for spices, started to challenge Portugal's monopoly. Their ships, faster and more maneuverable than the heavily laden Portuguese carracks, threatened the established flow of goods from the Moluccas and the Malabar coast to Lisbon. The English soon followed, seeking their share of pepper, cloves, and other exotic commodities, while France experimented with small expeditions into the Indian Ocean. In response, the Portuguese fortified their key ports, building imposing stone fortresses on Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. Massive cannons, thick walls, and garrisons of soldiers and sailors were designed to deter rivals and protect merchant convoys. Trade became inseparable from military strategy. Fleets were armed to both transport goods and enforce dominance, a delicate balance between commerce and war. Yet, controlling the seas was only part of the challenge. Portugal relied heavily on alliances with local rulers, paying tribute, negotiating treaties, and sometimes resorting to brutal displays of force. These relationships were fragile and constantly tested by local politics. In Malacca, the Portuguese faced resistance from regional sultans and merchant communities, forcing them to act both as administrators and as conquerors. Similarly, in Ceylon and India, Portuguese forces became entwined in regional conflicts, often choosing sides to protect trade interests. Beyond diplomacy and military might, navigation and cartography remained critical. Portuguese pilots and mapmakers meticulously recorded coastlines, currents, and harbors, creating knowledge that gave Lisbon an advantage over European rivals, but also inspired others to follow in their wake. Despite these precautions, cracks appeared. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, began a systematic campaign to capture Portuguese strongholds. By the early 17th century, key ports like Malacca and Ceylon fell into Dutch hands, marking the beginning of a slow retreat for Portugal in Asia. The empire that had once seemed unassailable was beginning to feel the pressures of overextension, competition, and local resistance. Still, Portuguese influence endured, particularly in Brazil, Macau, and Angola, where the crown focused resources and attention. The empire's story in Asia became a tale not just of conquest and trade, but of constant adaptation, survival, and the unyielding tension between ambition and reality. Each victory was accompanied by strain, each monopoly challenged by innovation, and each fortified city a reminder that power, no matter how formidable, is always temporary. Could Portugal withstand this rising tide of rivals, or was its golden age in Asia already approaching its twilight? While Portugal faced mounting challenges in Asia, its attention increasingly turned to the vast untamed lands across the Atlantic. Brazil, discovered in 1500 by Pedro Álvares Cabral, this enormous territory offered a new canvas for the empire's ambitions. Rich in resources and distant enough to avoid immediate European competition. Initially, the coastline was the focus. Small coastal settlements and trading posts, serving as outposts for sugar cultivation, timber, and later, gold. The landscape was both awe-inspiring and perilous. Dense tropical forests stretching endlessly. Rivers like veins carrying both opportunity and danger, and a climate that tested the endurance of European settlers. Indigenous peoples, diverse and complex societies, became both allies and obstacles. Some Portuguese settlers relied on local knowledge to navigate rivers, hunt, and cultivate crops, while others sought to dominate or displace native communities, often with brutal consequences. By the mid-16th century, sugar emerged as the engine of Brazil's economy, shaping settlement patterns and driving the creation of large plantations or engines. These plantations relied on the labor of enslaved Africans, forcibly transported across the Atlantic. The Portuguese had pioneered the early transatlantic slave trade along the African coast. But in Brazil, this system expanded into a sprawling, human-driven engine of wealth, producing sugar for Europe and generating immense profit for the crown and private merchants. Cities like Salvador, Recife, and later Rio de Janeiro began to take shape. Vibrant ports that buzzed with merchants, sailors, enslaved workers, and indigenous populations, their interactions producing a unique, hybrid culture. The Portuguese also faced threats from other European powers. French corsairs raided the coast, Dutch forces attempted to seize the northeast, and internal rebellions occasionally erupted. In response, forts were built, militias organized, and the crown maintained a constant presence, asserting sovereignty over an immense and often uncontrollable territory. Religion played a role as well. Jesuit missionaries traveled deep into the forests, establishing missions, converting natives, and sometimes acting as intermediaries between settlers and indigenous communities. By the 17th century, Brazil had transformed from a distant land of vague promise into the crown's most valuable colony, providing wealth that fueled Portugal's European ambitions and naval campaigns abroad. Yet, beneath the surface, tensions simmered between settlers and the crown, between colonists and indigenous peoples, and within the enslaved population itself. The Atlantic world was vast, dynamic, and often volatile, a theatre of immense opportunity and immense cruelty. Portugal's future would increasingly hinge on the success of Brazil, a colony that promised riches, power, and prestige, but also demanded constant vigilance and ruthless management. How could a small European kingdom maintain control over lands so distant, diverse, and defiant? The answer lay in adaptation, strategy, and the unrelenting will to hold an empire together against forces both internal and external. The 17th century opened with storms gathering on every horizon for Portugal's empire. The Dutch, newly independent from Spain and armed with a powerful merchant fleet, declared war not just with soldiers, but with commerce. Their weapon was the Dutch East India Company, VOC, a joint stock enterprise that combined private capital with state power, enabling them to build fleets larger and more disciplined than anything Portugal could field. From the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, Dutch ships appeared like wolves, striking at Portuguese convoys, besieging forts, and prying away one monopoly after another. Malacca, Ceylon, and eventually parts of the Moluccas slipped from Portuguese hands, turning Lisbon's once unrivaled spice network into a patchwork of contested ports. In the Atlantic, the struggle was just as fierce. The Dutch West India Company launched expeditions against Brazil, targeting the lucrative sugar plantations that poured wealth into Portugal's coffers. In 1624, the Dutch seized Salvador, the capital of Brazil, though Portuguese forces later reclaimed it. The conflict did not end. Their decades of back-and-forth campaigns followed, with Dutch control extending over parts of northeast Brazil, including until local resistance and the Crown's determination drove them out by 1654. The wars in Brazil were more than military struggles. They were battles for the economic heart of the empire. Sugar, white gold, had transformed Brazil into Portugal's richest colony, its plantations dependent on enslaved African labor. Ships carried thousands across the Atlantic in brutal conditions, their forced labor sustaining an industry that fed European markets and lined Lisbon's treasury. The Dutch, recognizing the profitability, sought to redirect this wealth toward Amsterdam, making the sugar fields of Brazil a global prize worth blood and steel. These wars also revealed the fragile foundations of Portugal's empire. Overstretched, underfunded, and reliant on scattered garrisons, the Crown struggled to defend every frontier. It leaned on settlers, missionaries, and local militias, blending formal military power with the rough pragmatism of colonial society. Still, Portugal endured. The eventual expulsion of the Dutch from Brazil marked a rare triumph, restoring the colony's security and reaffirming its central role in the empire. Yet in Asia, the story was different. The Dutch systematically dismantled Portuguese dominance, leaving only Goa, Macau, and a handful of ports as reminders of Lisbon's former glory. This uneven survival illustrated the shifting balance of power. Portugal's Atlantic empire thrived, but its eastern dominion withered under relentless competition. The empire's future would be increasingly Atlantic, with Brazil standing as its jewel and its burden. A land both enormously profitable and endlessly demanding. The Iberian Union, which bound Portugal and Spain under a single crown from 1580 to 1640, marked one of the most paradoxical chapters in Portuguese imperial history. On paper, Portugal retained its autonomy. It had its own government, laws, and overseas administration, and the Spanish monarchs pledged to respect these distinctions. But in practice, the merger proved disastrous. The enemies of Spain became the enemies of Portugal, and what had been a relatively neutral trading power suddenly found itself dragged into the orbit of Spain's endless wars. The Dutch, French, and English, all rivals of Madrid, now turned their cannons against Portuguese fleets and fortresses. Dutch privateers harassed Brazil's coasts. English corsairs struck at Portuguese convoys, and in Asia, rivals seized ports that Lisbon could no longer defend without. Spain's overstretched military dot. The Union also reshaped the empire's economic fortunes. The Spanish crown often siphoned off Portuguese resources to fund its European wars, draining the wealth that Lisbon had so carefully built through its trading monopolies. Worse, Spain's enemies attacked Portuguese colonies not only out of profit but as a way to cripple Madrid. Thus, Portugal's empire, once the most daring maritime enterprise in Europe, became collateral damage in the Habsburgs' continental ambitions. The Atlantic slave trade, the sugar wealth of Brazil, the spice commerce of the East all suffered under this web of conflict. At home, resentment simmered. Portuguese elites bristled at the loss of independence, and common people bore the burden of higher taxes and declining fortunes. In Brazil, colonists were frustrated by the crown's inability to protect them from Dutch encroachment. In Asia, governors complained that Madrid's neglect allowed the Dutch and English to choke off Portuguese trade. For 60 years, Portugal's sovereignty seemed an illusion, its empire a pawn in a larger struggle for European dominance. By the mid-17th century, this discontent erupted into open defiance. In 1640, as Spain reeled from revolts in Catalonia and the pressures of the 30 Years' War, Portuguese nobles launched a coup in Lisbon. The Duke of Braganza was proclaimed King João IV, restoring Portugal's independence after 6 decades of subjugation. But independence came at a price. The empire had been bled, many Asian possessions lost, and its once unrivaled position on the seas fatally undermined. The new Braganza dynasty faced the daunting task of rebuilding a battered realm while defending Brazil, the African forts, and the remnants of its Asian outposts. The Iberian Union had shown Portugal the danger of entanglement with larger powers and marked a turning point. Its empire would never again dominate global trade as it once had. With the proclamation of João IV in 1640, Portugal regained its independence, but what it inherited was a fractured empire stretched thin across oceans. The Restoration War with Spain, lasting until 1668, consumed much of the new Braganza dynasty's energy, while Portuguese soldiers fought on the Iberian Peninsula to secure sovereignty. The colonies faced relentless pressure from external enemies. In Brazil, Dutch forces occupied large stretches of the northeast, particularly Pernambuco and Recife, transforming them into a rival sugar hub. Local militias, enslaved Africans, and indigenous allies rose in revolt, culminating in the decisive battles of Garopis, where Portuguese and colonial forces drove out the Dutch by 1654. This triumph, however, came at enormous cost and illustrated the empire's shifting reality. Brazil had become the cornerstone of Portuguese survival, its sugar exports the lifeline of Lisbon's economy. In Africa, Portuguese forts at Luanda and Benguela provided the human cargo that fueled Brazil's plantations. These posts became more vital than ever as the slave trade intensified, while Dutch and English rivals contested the coasts of West Africa. Portugal clung desperately to Angola, Mozambique, and the Cape Verde Islands, recognizing that without African labor, Brazil's prosperity would collapse. The empire's identity, once global in scope, now revolved around a brutal Atlantic system of sugar and slavery. In Asia, the story was grimmer. Portuguese outposts that had once dominated the Indian Ocean trade were reduced to beleaguered enclaves. Goa remained a symbolic capital, but its influence waned as Dutch and English fleets tightened their grip over spices and textiles. Macau endured as Portugal's fragile gateway to China, though its fortunes depended on the goodwill of local Chinese officials and shifting tides of commerce. Malacca was lost, and Ceylon fell to the Dutch. Underscoring the irreversible retreat from Asia, the empire had traded the wide sweep of oceanic dominance for a narrower, but more profitable focus on Brazil. The Braganza monarchs understood this new reality. João IV and his successors concentrated on consolidating Brazil, protecting the slave routes, and negotiating with European rivals to secure recognition of Portugal's restored sovereignty. By the mid-17th century, Portugal was no longer the pioneer of discovery, but a secondary power clinging to its riches in the Americas. Still, Brazil's sugar economy, though increasingly challenged by Caribbean competitors, sustained the empire and gave Portugal a measure of resilience. The empire's future was no longer defined by spices from Asia or gold from Africa, but by the vast plantations of Brazil, tilled by enslaved labor, feeding European appetites and underwriting Lisbon's fragile independence. The dawn of the 18th century brought Portugal an unexpected transformation. In the rugged interior of Brazil, in the region of Minas Gerais, veins of gold were discovered in the 1690s. What followed was nothing short of a fever. Tens of thousands of settlers, adventurers, and enslaved Africans rushed into the highlands, tearing through rivers and soil in search of glittering treasure. By the early 1700s, Brazil was exporting more gold than any colony in the world, and Lisbon became the financial heart of Europe's new wealth. The discovery shifted the balance of the empire once again, cementing Brazil as Portugal's jewel and turning the Atlantic into the true axis of power. For Lisbon, the gold boom was both a blessing and a curse. Ships laden with bullion sailed regularly across the ocean, filling royal treasuries and financing grandiose projects at home. Baroque churches rose in both Lisbon and the mining towns of Brazil, their interiors gilded with local gold. The city of Ouro Preto became a symbol of opulence and faith. Its hillsides, dotted with ornate cathedrals built by enslaved labor and funded by the endless extraction of minerals. Yet beneath the glitter, harsh realities persisted. The mines devoured human lives. African captives toiled in brutal conditions, digging, panning, and carrying loads under constant surveillance. Mortality was staggering, but the demand for labor only grew, entrenching Portugal deeper into the transatlantic slave trade. By some estimates, nearly half of all enslaved Africans transported by Portugal ended up in Brazil, supplying both plantations and mines. Portugal itself grew dependent, not just on Brazilian gold, but also on foreign creditors. Much of the wealth flowing into Lisbon soon flowed out again, paid to England for manufactured goods under the terms of treaties like the Maritime Agreement of 1703. England supplied textiles and naval protection, while Portugal supplied wine and relied heavily on colonial riches. Lisbon became a city of contrasts. Lavish palaces glittered with Brazilian gold, while poverty simmered in the streets. The empire's fortunes were tied to a single colony, a dangerous imbalance. Still, the 18th century appeared to be an age of grandeur. Monarchs such as João V embraced the wealth, building monumental works like the Mafra Palace, intended to rival Europe's greatest courts. Lisbon's skyline gleamed, and Portugal projected the image of a stable, wealthy kingdom. But underneath, dependence, exploitation, and overconfidence gnawed at the foundations. The empire thrived on Brazilian mines, yet with each shipment of gold, it became increasingly vulnerable. What would happen if this golden river ever ran dry? On the morning of November 1st, 1755, Vol Saints de Lisbon awoke to catastrophe. As church bells rang and citizens crowded into cathedrals for mass, the earth began to tremble. Within minutes, the city was torn apart by one of the most devastating earthquakes in European history. Entire streets split open, buildings crumbled, and flames erupted as candles toppled into wooden beams. Survivors fled to the waterfront, only to see the sea pull back and then return as a massive tsunami, swallowing ships and drowning thousands. For nearly a week, fire consumed what the quake had not destroyed. When the smoke cleared, Lisbon was a ruin of ash and broken stone, and tens of thousands were dead. This disaster was more than a natural tragedy. It struck at the heart of Portugal's empire. Lisbon, swollen with Brazilian gold, was the nerve center of colonial administration, trade, and finance. Its destruction revealed how fragile that wealth truly was. Into this chaos stepped Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal. Appointed by King José I, Pombal became the architect of both Lisbon's reconstruction and Portugal's mid-18th century reforms. His response to the disaster was swift and ruthless. Bury the dead and feed the living, he is said to have commanded. Under his direction, Lisbon was rebuilt with straight avenues, earthquake-resistant architecture, and a vision of modern order. But Pombal's ambitions extended beyond city planning. He sought to centralize royal power, weaken the influence of the nobility and the Jesuits, and restructure Portugal's economy. Pombal cracked down on corruption, reorganized colonial administration, and tightened control over Brazil's gold and diamonds. He attempted to limit smuggling and ensure that more of the empire's wealth flowed directly into Lisbon's coffers. He also reformed education, pushing for secular and practical learning, while clashing bitterly with the Jesuit order, eventually expelling them from Portuguese lands in 1759. His policies strengthened the crown but made many enemies among aristocrats and clerics. For the empire, Pombal's reforms were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they modernized aspects of governance, helping Portugal compete at least briefly against stronger European rivals. On the other, they highlighted the dependence on Brazil's resources. Despite attempts at diversification, the empire's lifeblood still came from across the Atlantic. By the late 18th century, Brazilian gold production was declining, just as Lisbon was struggling to reassert itself after the earthquake. The optimism of recovery masked an uncomfortable truth. Portugal's empire was no longer expanding but fighting to preserve what remained. And as wealth dwindled, the seeds of unrest in Brazil were already beginning to sprout. As the 18th century wore on, the golden tide that had once flooded Portugal began to ebb. The mines of Minas Gerais, so rich in the early 1700s, showed signs of exhaustion by the 1760s. Output declined, costs rose, and Lisbon's dependence on colonial wealth grew ever more precarious. The Portuguese crown tried to maintain revenue through heavy taxation in Brazil, imposing strict quotas, known as the Gama, demanding that a set amount of gold be delivered each year, regardless of actual production. These pressures weighed heavily on settlers, miners, and especially enslaved Africans who continued to bear the brutal burden of extraction. Resentment simmered in the colonial society, not only among the enslaved and the oppressed, but also among the white elite who felt squeezed between dwindling resources and relentless demands from Lisbon. In this climate of frustration, new ideas began to circulate, these of liberty, self-determination, and independence. The American Revolution of 1776 and the currents of the Enlightenment in Europe resonated across the Atlantic. Educated Brazilians, some trained in Europe, returned with philosophies that questioned absolute monarchy and colonial subjugation. Secret gatherings in mining towns and universities whispered of change, of a future beyond Portugal's grasp. One of the most notable moments came in 1789 with the Inconfidencia Moneda, a failed conspiracy in Minas Gerais, inspired by both the American and French revolutions, led by a group of poets, intellectuals, and officers, including the dentist Joaquim José da Silva Xavier, known as Tiradentes. The movement envisioned a republic in Brazil free from Portuguese domination. Yet the conspiracy was betrayed, its leaders arrested, and Tiradentes publicly executed, his body dismembered and displayed as a warning. Though crushed, the rebellion planted seeds of resistance and became a powerful symbol in Brazilian history. Meanwhile, Portugal itself struggled with its place in Europe. Declining gold revenues meant increasing reliance on trade agreements with Britain, deepening economic dependency rather than independence. The once proud empire, first to carve a global domain, now found itself overshadowed by rising powers, Britain, France, and Spain, whose colonial machines outpaced Portugal's. Lisbon's streets, rebuilt after the earthquake, gleamed with Brazilian wealth, but behind the facades lay vulnerability. The empire's strength was fragile, tied to one colony, one flow of resources, one delicate balance that could not last forever. The question was no longer whether Brazil would resist, but when, and under what circumstances that resistance would erupt into a full break from the mother country. The dawn of the 19th century brought Portugal into a storm it could neither avoid nor fully control. For Europe was in turmoil under the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose armies swept across the continent, redrawing borders and shattering dynasties, and Portugal, bound by its ancient alliance with Britain, found itself targeted as a weak point in Napoleon's plan to strangle British trade. So in 1807, French forces under General Junot marched into Lisbon, prepared to seize the kingdom. But in an extraordinary moment of imperial survival, the Portuguese monarchy made a daring and unprecedented decision: to abandon the capital and relocate the entire royal court across the ocean to Brazil. Escorted by the British Navy, turning Rio de Janeiro overnight into the seat of a European empire in exile. This transfer, known as the Portuguese Royal Flight, was unlike anything seen in colonial history, for never before had a European monarch shifted his throne to a colony, and the symbolism was immense. Portugal was no longer the center of its own empire, Brazil was. King João VI, then Prince Regent, ruled from Rio, transforming the city into an imperial capital with royal palaces, academies, and institutions. And under his guidance, Brazil was elevated from colony to kingdom, united with Portugal in a transatlantic empire. For Brazilian elites, this sudden elevation brought opportunities and tensions alike. For while they enjoyed new prestige, it also highlighted Portugal's vulnerability and dependency. Meanwhile, back in Europe, resistance to French occupation smoldered, erupting into the Peninsular War, where Portuguese forces, alongside British troops under the Duke of Wellington, fought bitter campaigns to expel Napoleon's armies. Towns were ravaged, villages burned, and thousands perished. Yet from this crucible, Portugal emerged scarred but free, though still tethered tightly to British influence both militarily and economically. The irony was stark. While Portugal suffered devastation at home, Brazil flourished under royal presence, gaining institutions of higher learning, new trade freedoms, and a sense of self-confidence that Portugal itself lacked. By the time Napoleon was defeated and João VI considered returning to Lisbon, the balance of power within the empire had shifted permanently. The colony had tasted life as a capital, and its elite no longer saw themselves as mere subjects of a distant European king. A seed had been planted, one that would soon grow into the demand for full independence. Portugal's decision to survive by fleeing to Brazil may have saved its monarchy in the short term, but in the long run it ensured that its greatest colony would never remain under its shadow. By 1820, the world Portugal had known was unraveling. For the Congress of Vienna had restored Europe's monarchies, and with it came pressure for King João VI to return to Lisbon. Yet Brazil had grown accustomed to being the center of royal authority, and when the king finally departed in 1821, leaving his son, Dom Pedro, behind as regent, the fragile balance broke. For Portuguese elites sought to reassert control over Brazil, reducing it once more to a subordinate colony. But Brazilian elites who had tasted the power and prestige of self-governance refused to yield. And so began the chain of events that led to one of the most decisive ruptures in Portugal's history. In September 1822, Dom Pedro declared independence or death along the banks of the Ipa, proclaiming himself Emperor of Brazil, and with that Portugal's most prized possession. The jewel of its empire slipped irreversibly away. The loss was catastrophic not only in material terms. Brazil's resources, plantations, and trade had sustained Portugal's economy, but in psychological weight. For it shattered the illusion that the empire could still command loyalty across the Atlantic. Portugal was left weakened, impoverished, and politically unstable. Its monarchy scarred by accusations of incompetence. Its society split between conservatives clinging to imperial dreams and liberals demanding reform. The independence of Brazil also marked a turning point in global colonial history. For Portugal's retreat mirrored a broader pattern of collapsing European empires in the Americas. Yet, unlike Spain, whose empire fractured into many republics, Brazil remained united under a monarchy, highlighting the deep irony that Portugal had inadvertently created a rival empire out of its own colony. At home, the 1820s and 1830s saw Portugal descend into civil strife known as the Liberal Wars, where absolutists and constitutionalists fought brutally over the future of the crown, further weakening a nation already economically devastated by the loss of Brazil. British influence tightened, as loans and trade concessions bound Portugal more firmly to London's orbit, and the dream of global dominance faded into the shadows of memory. Yet even in decline, Portugal clung fiercely to its remaining colonies in Africa and Asia, desperate to salvage some vestige of imperial prestige. But the truth was undeniable. The empire had been broken at its core when Brazil declared independence. The Portuguese monarchy survived, but it did so diminished. Its glory reduced from that of a world-spanning empire to that of a struggling European kingdom haunted by the loss of its greatest colony. After the humiliation of losing Brazil, Portugal turned its eyes toward Africa with renewed desperation, determined to salvage what remained of its shattered empire. For in the mid-19th century, European powers were beginning to accelerate their scramble for the continent, and Portugal, though weakened, sought to assert claims stretching from Angola on the Atlantic to Mozambique on the Indian Ocean, dreaming of a transcontinental African empire that could restore its prestige and relevance. This vision, known as the Pink Map, reflected Portugal's ambition to link its coastal colonies across the interior. But the dream was far greater than the resources available to realize it. For Portugal was poor, politically unstable, and heavily dependent on Britain, whose own imperial ambitions clashed directly with Portuguese designs. The Pink Map came to symbolize both Portugal's lingering imperial pride and its vulnerability. For while Lisbon proclaimed sovereignty over vast territories, In reality, Portuguese control often extended little beyond coastal enclaves and a few fortified towns, with much of the African interior ruled by local kingdoms, chieftains, and trade networks that defied colonial authority. Still, the rhetoric of empire remained powerful, serving as a bomb for national humiliation, and successive governments used the promise of African riches, gold, ivory, rubber, and slaves even after the formal abolition of the trade to justify their fragile hold on power. But the scramble for Africa was unforgiving, and in 1890 Britain delivered a crushing blow by issuing an ultimatum demanding Portugal abandon its transcontinental ambitions, a diplomatic humiliation that sent shockwaves through Lisbon and provoked riots in the streets. For it revealed in stark terms that Portugal was no longer a first-tier imperial power, but a client state in the shadow of stronger empires. National pride was wounded deeply, and the monarchy's legitimacy suffered another blow, feeding growing republican sentiments that accused the crown of weakness and dependency. Yet Portugal clung stubbornly to Angola and Mozambique, pouring scarce resources into garrisons and expeditions to extend control inland, often at staggering human and financial cost. The empire had become a paradox, a symbol of national identity and pride on one hand, and on the other a crushing burden that bled Portugal's treasury and exposed its impotence in the face of stronger powers. By the dawn of the 20th century, Portugal's African colonies had become both the justification for its continued claim to greatness and the chains that dragged it deeper into poverty and instability, a haunting reminder that the glory of the Age of Discovery had long since given way to fragile illusions of empire. By the turn of the 20th century, the cracks in Portugal's monarchy had widened into chasms that could no longer be hidden. For the humiliations of the British ultimatum of 1890, the economic stagnation that crippled industry, and the crushing weight of maintaining distant colonies had combined to strip the crown of its authority in the eyes of the people. The monarchy, once the symbol of Portugal's golden age of exploration, was now ridiculed as weak, corrupt, and subservient to foreign powers, and discontent festered in every corner of society. Republicans seized upon this anger, portraying themselves as the true defenders of national dignity, promising to modernize Portugal and restore its pride, while monarchists clung desperately to imperial rhetoric and hollow symbols of glory that no longer resonated with the suffering masses. Strikes erupted, student movements mobilized, and secret societies plotted in the shadows, their goal the destruction of the monarchy itself. The streets of Lisbon and Porto became theatres of unrest, with violent clashes between royalist forces and revolutionaries. The assassination of King Carlos I in 1908, carried out in broad daylight as his carriage moved through Lisbon, shocked the nation and revealed just how fragile the monarchy had become. His son, Manuel II, a young and inexperienced ruler, inherited a throne already rotting beneath him, and within 2 years the final blow was struck. On October 5, 1910, the Republican Revolution erupted, and after a brief but decisive uprising, the monarchy collapsed, the royal family fled into exile, and the Portuguese First Republic was declared. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags and chanting slogans, celebrating what they believed was the dawn of a new era, free from royal incompetence and foreign domination. Yet the reality of the Republic was far darker than its promise, for Portugal was deeply divided, its institutions weak, and its economy still fragile. While the monarchy had fallen, the underlying problems of poverty, illiteracy, and dependency on colonial illusions remained, and the Republic soon found itself plagued by coups, assassinations, and endless factionalism. The collapse of the monarchy did not bring stability but rather chaos, and in the decades that followed, Portugal lurched from one crisis to another, clinging desperately to its African colonies as its last claim to relevance. The empire, though already hollow, was used by the Republic as a fragile shield against the reality that Portugal was no longer a great power but a small, struggling nation caught between its imperial past and an uncertain future. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Portugal found itself once again drawn into the orbit of its ancient ally Britain. And though initially neutral, it was inevitable that the Republic would be pulled into the conflict, for Britain pressed Portugal to seize German ships in its ports and defend its colonies in Africa against German incursions. In 1916, Germany declared war on Portugal, thrusting a fragile republic already torn by factionalism into the furnace of a global conflict it was ill-prepared to fight. Thousands of Portuguese soldiers were conscripted and sent to the Western Front, where they endured the mud, cold, and terror of trench warfare alongside larger Allied forces. But Portugal's contribution was marked more by suffering than by triumph. At the Battle of La Lys in 1918, Portuguese troops, poorly equipped and demoralized, were overwhelmed by a massive German assault, leading to catastrophic losses that haunted the national memory for generations. In Africa, the war brought chaos to Angola and Mozambique, where Portuguese forces struggled to defend their colonial claims against better-armed German troops and local resistance movements, revealing just how tenuous Lisbon's grip on its empire truly was. At home, the war deepened the Republic's instability, for the cost of mobilization drained an already weak economy. Food shortages provoked riots, and political violence intensified. Instead of uniting the nation, the war further divided it, exposing the Republic's inability to govern effectively. When the war ended in 1918, Portugal emerged not as a victor but as a nation exhausted, humiliated, and destabilized, its sacrifices overshadowed by the achievements of greater powers. The promised rewards of war never materialized, and Portugal was left with little more than debt, grief, and disillusionment. The dream of restoring national prestige through empire and alliance had crumbled once more, and the Republic staggered under the weight of its failures. In the following years, coups, assassinations, and military uprisings became commonplace. As one government after another fell in rapid succession, each claiming to offer salvation but delivering only deeper chaos. The empire, clung to desperately, was increasingly revealed as a burden rather than a blessing, yet Portugal lacked the strength to either reform it or abandon it. The scars of the Great War became yet another wound in a long chain of betrayals, humiliations, and illusions that marked Portugal's decline, setting the stage for a new and darker chapter in its history, one where dictatorship would rise, promising order and strength where the Republic had only delivered weakness and despair. In the aftermath of the First World War, the Portuguese Republic disintegrated under the weight of its failures, for instead of delivering freedom, prosperity, and stability, it descended into a revolving door of short-lived governments, each more ineffectual than the last, as corruption, poverty, and political violence consumed the nation. Between 1910 and 1926, more than 40 different administrations rose and fell, often toppled by coups or assassinations. While strikes paralyzed industry, soldiers mutinied in the streets, and anarchists clashed with monarchists and republicans, alike leaving Portugal a nation adrift without direction. The empire remained intact in name but weakened in practice. as unrest in Africa and Asia forced Lisbon to divert what few resources it had into maintaining garrisons and suppressing revolts. While at home, inflation spiraled and hunger stalked the poor. It was in this climate of despair that the military intervened in 1926, staging a coup that swept away the broken republic and installed a dictatorship that promised stability and discipline where chaos had prevailed. The man who soon emerged as the true master of Portugal was Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, a reserved economist from Coimbra, who rose first as finance minister and then, by 1932, as prime minister, constructing the authoritarian system known as the Estado Novo. Salazar, a deeply conservative Catholic, believed democracy had failed Portugal, and he replaced it with a corporatist state where political parties were banned, censorship was imposed, dissent was ruthlessly crushed, and the church was restored to a privileged role. He wrapped his dictatorship in the language of tradition, discipline, and patriotism, presenting himself as the savior of Portugal's eternal identity, while at the same time committing the nation to preserving its empire at all costs. Salazar declared that Portugal was not a small European country but a pluricontinental nation, a single body stretching across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Atlantic, and that to abandon its colonies would be to commit national suicide. Under his regime, the empire was recast as sacred and indivisible, no longer colonies but overseas provinces, equal to the Portuguese mainland in theory if not in reality. Though Salazar avoided the reckless militarism of fascist powers, like Italy and Germany, his dictatorship shared their obsession with hierarchy, order, and the suppression of liberty, and his insistence on clinging to empire would drag Portugal into wars it could not win, isolating it from the international community and ensuring that its decline, though delayed, would ultimately be more brutal and painful. By the early 1960s, Salazar's vision of a pluricontinental Portugal was already beginning to collapse under the weight of global decolonization and the relentless pressure of nationalist movements rising across Africa. Yet he refused to concede a single inch of territory, declaring again and again that Portugal was not a colonial empire but a unitary nation spread across continents, a claim that increasingly sounded like denial rather than strength. When rebellion broke out in Angola in 1961, marked by mass uprisings and bloody reprisals, it shattered the illusion that Portugal's overseas provinces were peaceful extensions of the metropole, and what followed was a brutal, drawn-out struggle that would last for over a decade. Thousands of Portuguese conscripts, many of them young men pulled from villages in rural Portugal, were shipped to Africa to fight against guerrilla forces armed and trained by the Soviet Union, Cuba, and China, while at the same time Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau also rose in revolt, forcing Lisbon to spread its already overstretched forces across 3 distant and hostile fronts. The wars were marked by atrocities on both sides, with civilians often caught in the middle, and the financial burden drained Portugal's already fragile economy, as resources that might have modernized the nation at home were poured into a futile attempt to maintain empire abroad. Unlike Britain or France, who negotiated withdrawals and cultivated neo-colonial influence, Portugal clung stubbornly to its colonies, insisting that to let them go would be to admit weakness. Yet each year of war eroded public support, alienated Portugal further from its allies, and revealed the profound unsustainability of Salazar's dream. At home, censorship and propaganda painted the wars as noble struggles, but reality seeped through in the form of dead soldiers, disillusioned veterans, and an increasingly restless younger generation who saw no future in endless sacrifice for a lost cause. Internationally, Portugal faced growing condemnation at the United Nations, where its refusal to decolonize marked it as an outlier among European powers, and sanctions and diplomatic isolation further deepened its crisis. Oil discovered off Cabinda in Angola gave Lisbon a temporary source of funding for the wars, but no amount of revenue could erase the truth that Portugal was fighting against the tide of history. By the end of the 1960s, it was clear to the world, though not yet to Salazar and his regime, that Portugal's insistence on preserving its empire at all costs was not a strategy of strength, but an act of desperation, one that would inevitably break the Estado Novo itself. By the early 1970s, the Estado Novo regime stood like an aging fortress, rigid and unyielding, yet rotting from within. As Portugal's colonial wars in Africa dragged on with no end in sight and the nation at home stagnated under dictatorship, poverty and repression, the wars in Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau consumed more than 40% of the national budget, drawing hundreds of thousands of young men into endless service, while in Lisbon, Salazar had fallen from power after a stroke in 1968, replaced by Marcelo Caetano, a man who promised reform but delivered only continuity. The pressure of fighting 3 simultaneous wars began to erode the loyalty of the very institution. The regime relied upon most the military, where young officers saw their lives wasted in conflicts that offered no victory and no honor, only endless death in distant jungles and savannas. Secretly, many of them began to conspire, forming the Armed Forces Movement, a network of disillusioned captains and majors who envisioned not just an end to the colonial wars, but the overthrow of the dictatorship itself. The breaking point came on April 25, 1974, when tanks rolled into Lisbon not to suppress dissent, but to liberate the nation. In an astonishing reversal of history, the coup unfolded with almost no bloodshed, as civilians poured into the streets offering carnations to the soldiers, sliding flowers into the barrels of rifles and the muzzles of machine guns, transforming what could have been a violent revolution into a symbolic rebirth. The Estado Novo crumbled in hours. Caetano was forced to resign, and suddenly, after nearly half a century of authoritarian rule, Portugal was free to breathe again. But the empire, already fragile, collapsed even faster. Within months, Lisbon announced negotiations with liberation movements in Africa, and by 1975 Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe all declared independence, while East Timor would briefly follow before falling into Indonesian occupation. The speed of the decolonization was breathtaking, a collapse so sudden that millions of Portuguese settlers, known as retornados, were forced to flee back to the metropole, leaving behind businesses, homes, and lives built over generations. What had taken centuries to construct had unraveled in less than a year, leaving Portugal stunned, exhausted, and uncertain of its place in the modern world. The empire was gone, the wars were over, and the nation now faced the daunting task of redefining itself, no longer as a global power but as a small European democracy struggling to recover from decades of dictatorship and decline. The end of the Portuguese Empire in the mid-1970s marked not only the collapse of centuries of overseas dominion, but also the rebirth of Portugal itself, a nation forced to look inward after so long defining itself by what lay overseas. Yet even in its demise, the empire left behind echoes that continue to shape the world today. Across Africa, the sudden withdrawal of Portuguese authority created both opportunity and chaos, as liberation movements transformed into ruling governments overnight, often burdened with weak institutions, fragile economies, and the scars of years of brutal war. Angola and Mozambique fell quickly into devastating civil conflicts, fed by Cold War rivalries, while Guinea-Bissau struggled with political instability and East Timor endured violent annexation by Indonesia, showing how the vacuum left by empire could unleash decades of suffering. In Portugal itself, the end of empire forced the return of nearly 1 million settlers, the retornados, who flooded back into a homeland unprepared to absorb them, straining housing, jobs, and social services, yet also bringing with them cultural diversity, capital, and a sense of cosmopolitanism that gradually reshaped Portuguese identity. The Carnation Revolution opened the door to democracy, joining Portugal more closely to Europe, and eventually integration into the European Union offered the nation a new direction. But the memory of empire still lingered in its language, in its diaspora, and in the contested ways it remembered its past. Brazil, the great jewel lost long before, remained the largest Portuguese-speaking nation in the world, while Angola, Mozambique, and others carried forward the Lusophone heritage, creating a global Portuguese community that stretched across continents even after political power had dissolved. For historians, the empire stands as both triumph and tragedy, a pioneering global network that spread ideas, technology, and culture, but also slavery, exploitation, and violence on a scale that reshaped entire continents. Some see in Portugal's story the tale of a small nation that dared to imagine the oceans as its frontier, while others see a cautionary lesson about the costs of ambition and the fragility of power. What is certain is that the Portuguese Empire, once the first to span the globe, has left an indelible imprint on the modern world, its ports, its maps, its languages, and its legacies still alive in the fabric of nations today. The empire is gone, but its shadow remains, reminding us of how the tides of history rise and fall, and how even the mightiest dreams of empire are destined to vanish into the sea.